My name is Robert Blunt, and I'm Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies, and I'll be introducing our speaker this evening, Derek Peterson, in a few minutes. Before I do, however, a few acknowledgments are in order. Our lecture tonight, entitled Non-Conformist Christianity in Africa's Cultural History, is sponsored by the Department of Religious Studies, the Earl A. Pope Guest Speaker Fund, the Lyman Coleman Guest Speaker Fund, and is also being supported by the Program of Africana Studies. I wanted to especially acknowledge the brilliant logistical work that our departmental administrator, Laura McGee, has put into making tonight's event possible. Laura's not here tonight, but Laura really is our rock in the Department of Religious Studies, and if she was not steering our organizational ship, we would be lost often. So wanted to thank Laura. And of course, on behalf of the Religious Studies Department, we want to welcome the family members and friends of Earl Pope who are here with us tonight. So thank you for making it on this very cold evening. Before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to take a few, maybe even several minutes to tell you who Earl Pope was, the beloved faculty member for whom this speaker series is named. As an anthropologist of religion in Africa, I would like to invite you to think of this series as Earl's ancestral shrine. Such shrines in many classic anthropological accounts are not simply tombs. Rather, they are the actual homes of deceased elders, which require ongoing ritualized maintenance by his or her descendants as a dutiful acknowledgement of their ongoing role in the daily social life of the living. Professor Pope's profound record of research and exemplary teaching about issues of global ecumenicalism and the protection of religious minorities in post-socialist Europe is a model for these troubled times, I think, an ethical code to be emulated right now. So it is in this spirit of honorable social obligation to our honored departmental ancestor and his ethical impulses that I wanted to have set the tone for our celebration this evening. So the biography I'm about to read was prepared by the chair of the Religious Studies Department, Professor Eric Zolkowski, and was read to the faculty at the December 2011 faculty meeting commemorating Earl Pope a few months after his death. Copies of the full text from which I'm reading are stacked by the entrance of the lecture hall, and please feel free to grab a copy on the way out if you're interested. And I would also ask you to forgive my potential butchering of Romanian place names, which is likely to ensue. So, born in Tolca, Romania, on August 18th, 1920, Earl A. Pope immigrated to the United States with his parents. After growing up in Akron, Ohio, he attended Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, earning an A.B. in religion and an M.A. in theology. He proceeded to Yale University Divinity School, where he took an MDiv degree in the history of Christianity. And while at Yale in 1948, he met Miriam Mim Nielsen, Cromwell, Connecticut. They were married on September 9th in 1950. For the next decade, Pope was the minister of churches in Floral Park, New York, from 1950 to 53, and in Cranston, Rhode Island, from 54 to 57, and Rumford, Rhode Island, from 57 to 60. While serving at the Rumford Church, he also served for 2 years as a teaching fellow at Brown University, where he also completed his education with a PhD in religious studies and American history. In 1960, Pope joined the faculty of Lafayette College, where he taught in the Department of Religion for the next 30 years. While rising through the ranks and eventually being named the Helen H.P. Manson Professor of Bible, he served as secretary, vice chair, and chair of the Lafayette chapter of the American Association of University Professors, headed the Department of Religion from 1977 to 1985, served as Dean of Studies from 1970 to 72, and did tours of duty on numerous important faculty committees, often chairing them. Because the religion department was very small, Pope, like its other members, taught a wide range of subjects. His courses in his areas of specialization included Christian scriptures, history of religion in America, contemporary religious issues, contemporary religious movements, contemporary Protestant dialogue, religion in Eastern Europe, the religious situation in the Soviet Union, and religion in a post-communist world. He also taught key topics in Christian thought, Christianity and Judaism, Jewish-Christian dialogue, and the Holocaust, and the department's main introductory course, which was then called Basic Types of Religion, covering Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism. So over the years, Pope became a tireless, pioneering promoter of global studies at Lafayette College. An integral member of the Russian and Eastern European Studies program, he co-directed trips for Lafayette students to Russia and Romania, and he and Mim also hosted several students from Moldova in their home on different occasions. In his travels, he cultivated valuable contacts with church leaders all over Eastern Europe. Ever effective in the classroom and popular with students, Pope was honored with Lafayette's Thomas Roy and Laura Forrest Jones Faculty Award for Superior Teaching in 1970, and the Christian R. and Mary F. Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching and Contributions to the campus community in 1980. Pope's numerous scholarly interests range from church history and dogma to biblical studies and ecumenical issues of partnership, understanding, and justice. He began as a specialist in American religious history, publishing an important book on New England Calvinism and the disruption of the Presbyterian Church, which was published in 1987. However, from the early 70s on, his scholarly attention was increasingly drawn to the religious life in communist Eastern Europe, and he came to be widely recognized as a groundbreaking authority on that subject. He traveled often and widely there. And in 1977 to 78, he was an International and Research Exchanges Board Award recipient and an invited Fulbright Hays Faculty Research Scholar in Romania. Later, he was awarded the Romanian Patriarchal Cross of Honor for his ecumenical contributions, and in 1980, he coordinated a conference on Romanian studies at Lafayette. In 1987 through 89, Pope served as president of the Society of Romanian Studies. And in 1989, he was elected to the Executive Committee of Christians Associated for Relations with Eastern Europe. He was a consultant to the International Academy on Religious Freedom, which conducted its first conference in Romania. Pope did not miss a beat after he became the last Lafayette faculty member to be required under the old rules to retire at age 70 in 1990. Yes. He served as a member of the Fulbright Selection Committee, as an international observer of Romania's presidential and parliamentary elections in 1992, as a senior Fulbright professor at the University of Bucharest in 92 to 94. He participated in numerous religious and educational organizations and events, and also organized a highly successful seminar entitled Encounter of Religions in the Black Sea Area at the Black Sea University in Mangalia, Romania. The seminars, which continued for years afterward, cultivated interreligious cooperation and tolerance in a region historically beset by religious tensions and conflicts. The program drew participants representing various Christian churches and denominations, as well as Jews and Muslims from 12 different nations of the region. Earl Pope was a trustee of the prestigious Albert Schweitzer Award for Humanitarians, an award established to advance humanitarianism in the U.S. through recognition of extraordinary achievement. In 1997, he was led by his own humanitarian impulse to confront Dr. Emil Constantinescu, the then president of Romania. In a poignant 5-page letter to Constantinescu, dated May 31st of that year, Pope expressed his profound disappointment over a reported, quote, sudden change in the religious policy by the Ministry of Cults in Romania. Interesting title. Accompanied, of course, by recent incidents of violent persecutions against religious minorities, including Baptists, in that country. Pope wrote, quote, "It has been my conviction that religious freedom is a fundamental, indeed sacred human right and an integral component of an open democratic society." He called for a public apology and assurances that such discriminations and violence would not be tolerated, and he warned Constantinescu that continued violations of religious rights in Romania could have negative repercussions about the otherwise improving relations between Romania and the United States, whose current president and vice president at the time, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, both happened to be Baptists. Pope's letter demonstrably hit its mark within months. Constantinescu and the Romanian Prime Minister Victor Ciorbea assured a delegation of Baptist leaders of their commitment to religious freedom, and an apology was extended for the discriminatory incidents. Another legacy of Pope's Eastern European travels and sojourns is the fascinating and diverse array of materials he amassed, not only in English, but in Russian, Hungarian, Romanian, and other languages of the region. Beginning in the 1990s, he donated large quantities of material to the Princeton Theological Seminary Library. The Pope Collection there consists of hundreds of books and pamphlets documenting religion and culture in Eastern Europe. What Pope meant to this faculty is captured by the words of two of his much younger former colleagues. Said one, Professor Patricia Donahue, Earl Pope was a peach, one of the nicest people I've ever met. Said the other, Professor Josh Miller, he was a lion of the Lafayette faculty. He had a courtly, distinctive way of talking, but within his graciousness, he said powerful things. No one who knew Earl Pope will forget his irrepressible smile, cheerful eyes, and his unfailingly and arrestingly upbeat mode of salutation, whether in easy or tough times, rain or shine. How are you? Good to see you. Tonight's speaker, Derek Peterson, I can assure you is a scholar, teacher, and colleague of a very similar spirit. Derek Peterson received his PhD in African history from the University of Minnesota in 2000. Currently, he is professor in the Department of History and Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. His scholarly work concerns the intellectual and cultural history of Eastern Africa. Professor Peterson has, I would say, significantly advanced our understanding of the processes and politics of Christian conversion in colonial Africa. A very contentious debate between historians and anthropologists that has been ongoing for the better part of 2 decades. Peterson's most recent book, Ethnic Patriotism, and the East African Revival, published in 2012, won the Melville Herskovits Award of the African Studies Association, which is for the best book in African studies published during the calendar year, and the Martin Klein Prize of the American Historical Association, which recognizes the most distinguished work of scholarship on African history published in English during the previous calendar year. In 2016, he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in African Studies and elected a Fellow of the British Academy. Before coming to the University of Michigan from 2004 to 2009, Professor Peterson was senior lecturer in history, director of the African Studies Center, and fellow of Selwyn College at Cambridge University. Ably filling the shoes of John Lonsdale upon his retirement from Cambridge, the most notable historian of East Africa. During Peterson's directorship, the center inaugurated the Cambridge Africa Collaborative Research Program, which, with funding from the Leverhulme Trust, annually brought 6 or 7 Africa-based scholars to Cambridge to work on overlapping research projects. And in 2008, the Ohio University Press launched the Cambridge African Studies Center book series as a means of bringing these fellows' scholarship to public notice. Peterson edits the series with several of his colleagues from Cambridge, and I think I will end there with Derek's dedication to promoting the work of scholars who are based in Africa. It is not easy for African scholars to get the same types of scholarly mentorship, publishing help, or the international recognition that publishing with an American or English university press often bestows on its authors. So without further delay, I would like to formally welcome this year's presenter of the annual Earl A. Pope Lecture in Global Christianity, Professor Derek Peterson.
Thanks very much, Rob. That's very kind. And thank you to the Earl Pope Lecture Committee and to this Department of Religious Studies for the invitation to come here and speak this evening. I'm very much honored, and it's been a great pleasure for me to be here this past day to learn about what's happening in Lafayette. I have to say that the concentration of scholars here who work on Africa, who do such distinguished work, is really impressive, and I think you all should recognize that fact. You've got, I think, a really exciting field of opportunity here to bring folks, students, graduate students, potentially at least, and faculty together on the grounds of this concentration of expertise in the study of Africa. Let me also thank Rob particularly for the invitation and the help that he's given me in organizing the logistics, and also Laura McKee in absentia. Christian nonconformity has received scant scholarly attention in the study of African cultural history generally. The emphasis in scholarship in Africa has been on continuity, that is, on the connections that draw contemporary African Christianity together with the old ancestral traditional religion. In theology, as in anthropology and in intellectual history, the old religion is often conceived as a foundation, establishing a symbolic and discursive repertoire that Africans could use to interpret Christian ideas. Even when converts describe the process of conversion as a radical transformation in their lives, scholars have generally set it as their task to uncover the continuities that link contemporary African Christianity with ancestral precedents. This way of thinking about Christian history, in fact, has its roots in the Protestant missionary project. Missionaries in East Africa, as in other parts of the continent, sought to build upon the old religion, not to supplant it. Their model, theologically and practically, was Paul's discourse in the Areopagus in Rome, or in Athens rather, discussed in Acts chapter 17. Those of you who aren't acquainted with Acts chapter 17, let me give you a brief resume. In his homily, the Apostle Paul offers a definition of the unknown God, a character that the Athenians had previously worshipped in ignorance. Paul gives this character a history, that is, he made all things, or he made the world and all things therein. He also gives this character an identity. In him we move and live and have our being, and then invites his listeners to repent of their sins. For British evangelicals of the 19th century, Paul's discourse at the Areopagus was the model for Christian evangelism in Africa. As one Anglican divine named Christopher Wordsworth put it in 1857, the discourse at the Areopagus is the model and pattern, as he said, to all Christian missionaries for their addresses to the heathen world. With Paul's example before them, British missionaries set out in the 19th century to make converts, to name, that is, and identify and preach about previously unknown gods. Christian missionaries were therefore the first systematic theologians of African traditional religion. To take one example among many, the first Christian missionaries in the German colony of German East Africa, shown on the screen, initially lamented the poverty of the Gogo vernacular language in which they worked. Ugogo is shown in the center of the map. As one of them wrote in 1881, this is a man named J.T. Last, "The Gogo people have no idea of the purity of God or of that righteousness which is essential to a person becoming a member of his kingdom. They have no literature or any traditions likely to lead their minds to discover a higher state of righteousness." But in August that very same year, this previously dismissive missionary set out to make a dictionary. He ruled a notebook in parallel columns with Ugogo, or Chigogo on one side rather, and English on the other, and then wrote down, as he said, what I thought were the most suitable English words from A to Z in their proper places, and then, as I found the native words, I had only to put them down in the places allotted to them. Dictionaries imposed an order on an otherwise unsuitable and unreachable vernacular language. There are at least 4 handwritten English Chigogo dictionaries that have survived in the archives of central Tanzania. On their pages, missionaries established a correspondence between generic religious concepts on the one hand and Chigogo words on the other. Thus, God became Mulungu in Chigogo. Believe became Ihuila. Sacrifice became Ikumbiko. With the vocabulary aligned on the page, missionaries found it easy to, quite suddenly, appreciate Gogo religion. As one of them said in a letter dating to 1886, their language is remarkably complete. Their traditions are such as to repay amply the time and effort required to master them, while their parables and tribal laws are assets of no mean value. Once the discursive and linguistic foundation was in place, in other words, missionaries could compare the old religion on the one hand with the Christian revelation on the other. In 1886, the missionary J.C. Price, traveling through Gogo country, met with a group of elders who inquired after his purpose in visiting them. As he said, "I have come to Ugogo only to tell you something you did not know about the God who gives you food, rain, life, and strength. His son came down from heaven," said Price. Undoubtedly, he had that Acts passage I was talking about earlier on the mind. Price was taking a Gogo term, Mulungu, and giving it a new Christian identity. One Gogo chief asked the missionary how to pray to God, and Price told him, as he said, to go and speak to God alone, away from everyone else. When the chief asked about Uganga, which the dictionaries had defined as witchcraft, and Nkumbiko, which were the sacrifices that Gogo people had made to their elders, the missionary told them that they were all of no use, as he said. Missionaries were establishing a novel set of practices by which Gogo people could relate to a God who they hitherto had known only distantly. They were setting up, in some senses, the traditional religion as a kind of preparation for the gospel, establishing, that is, structures, linguistic, discursive, and symbolic, by which the Christian gospel could be preached. In the 1960s, the decade of African political independence, a generation of African theologians returned to the dictionaries and anthropological studies that missionaries had authored and used them as evidence by which to reconstruct the logic and character of what came to be called African traditional religion. They were driven by pressingly political concerns. African nation builders were, in the 1960s, busily sorting out their cultural property, identifying legal codes, styles of dress, and languages that could testify to the authenticity of African political culture. So, for instance, in his inaugural address as president of independent Tanzania, this man, Julius Nyerere, announced the formation of a ministry for national culture and youth, proclaiming, as he said, "I have set up this new ministry to help us regain our pride in our own culture. I want it to seek out the best of the traditions and customs of all the tribes and to make them part of our national culture." In the legal arena, Tanzania's rulers sought to standardize local customs, creating a unitary form. The goal, in the words of one official, was to write the laws which arise from the customs and practices of the tribes of the people of Tanzania, so that in future times they will be obeyed by all Tanzanians like the law of the English. Theologians likewise worked to build the nation. The Kenyan theologian John Mbiti was appointed lecturer at Makerere University in Uganda in 1964. As a matter of urgency, he was instructed by his department chair to establish a new course on African religions. And in 1969, he published his lecture notes under the title African Traditional Religions and Philosophies, the cover of which is shown on the screen. Mbiti had missionaries' dictionaries open in front of him as he composed his lectures. Like Protestant missionaries, he sought to illuminate the logic of the old religion, casting African traditional religion as an integrated system of rituals and symbols that could parallel Christianity. With the vocabularic evidence before him, Mbiti and his contemporaries argued that Africans already knew the sacred and already recognized God prior to Christian missionaries' arrival in Africa. Their foreknowledge they argued, made it easy for Africans to accommodate Christianity within a broader and deeper conception of traditional religious life. As one theologian, the Kenyan theologian J.N.K. Mugambi put it, Africans do not have to choose between being Christian and being African. They can be both Christian and African at the same time. Now, this conception of African traditional religion has been subject to critique, not least by distinguished anthropologists like John Peel and Rosalind Shaw. Professor Blunt's own scholarship is very much framed in such a way as to problematize static understandings of African traditional religion. But the emphasis on continuity continues to guide both historical and anthropological work on African Christianity and on African religions more generally. The project seems always to show how contemporary Christian ideas grow out of older cultural forms, how, as one historian put it in a recent book title, Africans domesticated a religious import. Religion scholars maintain that the things that they study, symbols, logics, power dynamics, are not readily subject to change. Culture, in this view, structures action and thought in such a way as to ensure that it will be continually passed on. In Ogbu Kalu's recent textbook about African Christianity, even unorthodox revivalist movements are said, as Kalu wrote, to manifest a certain sense of continuity with the traditional past, embedding African Christianity into the deep structure of all African traditional religions, in spite of varieties of names and symbols. The most recent scholarly overview is from Stephen Ellis and Gary Tahar, a book called Worlds of Power, in which the focus is on Africans' collective mentality, not on their creative thought. Ellis and Tahar tour through arenas of public life. There's chapters on politics, economics, legal discourse, etc., showing how at every turn, Africans' essentially religious worldview informs their action in the material world. In this account, there's little space for the analysis of radical change, dissonance, or rupture. Religion and the mundane are everywhere naturalized, forming an integrated field of action. The point I want to make this evening is this. There was much that was odd and idiosyncratic and upsetting about Africa's Christianity. Not every cultural production was anchored in the distant past. There were a great number of heterodoxies. Many of them emerged out of dissident readings of Christian scriptures. African nonconformists, like nonconformists everywhere, studied the Bible intensely, and from it they derived inspiration for strange, cloistered, and weird ways of living. Christians of the establishment, that is, European missionaries and African elders alike, looked upon nonconformists with scorn. Establishment Christianity encouraged Africans to see themselves as inheritors of their ancestors' wisdom. Establishment Christianity upheld the powers that be, buttressed traditions, reinforced notionally traditional gender roles, encouraged the standardization of vernacular languages, and encouraged also the writing of inspirational histories of people groups. In this way, establishment Christianity was an engine for the creation of invented traditions. Nonconformists horrified the establishment because they wouldn't bend their knee to notions of ancestral tradition, to convention, or to inherited wisdom. They interpreted the Bible without reference to the enclosures of orthodoxy. So in this lecture, I want to study the interpretive habits, that is, the ways of reading that promoted nonconformity. As we'll see, nonconformists invested themselves in specific parts of the Bible, looking for fragments of text that could authenticate idiosyncratic ways of living. They left a scant documentary trace. Theirs was not a Christianity that tended toward the memorial or the library. Their interpretive practices inclined them to live athwart the great narratives of their time. That is, the narrative of recovery, restitution, and cultural heritage that have generally structured the project of conservative reform. So, Christian missionaries were undoubtedly avid and eager translators of the Bible, but they were actually quite worried about the Old Testament. The Catholic bishop of Nyasaland thought the Old Testament to be, as he said, very dangerous. And in a letter, he said that he would refuse to allow its translation into African languages and would refuse his daughter, if he had a daughter, permission to read the Old Testament until she was married. Uganda missionaries brought out a heavily redacted series of Old Testament stories several decades before the Old Testament itself was published. Phrased in simple language, these stories were pithy tales about heroism, self-sacrifice, and devotion. Kenya missionaries likewise brought out a sanitized version of Old Testament stories. This book is called Mohoro Matene Tene, Stories of Long Ago in Kikuyu, published, as you'll see, in 1936, although there's an edition that goes back to 1908. It took 50 years before they brought out the Old Testament itself. The Old Testament was published in 1951. The lead translator responsible for the rendering of the Old Testament into Kikuyu was a man named Arthur Barlow, who worried, as he said, that Kikuyu readers would try to understand and read it for themselves without any outside aid. They will have no one at hand to whom they may turn for an explanation of the very many strange things they will encounter. During the Mau Mau War, which gripped central Kenya in the 1950s, Kikuyu men kept in British-run detention camps were furnished with copies of the New Testament in Kikuyu. One of the missionaries who worked in Mau Mau detention camps hoped that the text could help show recalcitrant Mau Mau detainees, as he said, how Paul changes his attitude of opposition to missionaries, how the most terrible sins can be forgiven, how the teaching of Jesus gives absolute moral standards, and how a government setup accords with the will of God. The Old Testament was kept out of Mau Mau detainees' hands. It was thought to be subversive literature. Missionaries' investment in the New Testament was paralleled in early African converts' political thought. The story of the New Testament is a story of cultural renovation. The protagonists are a small band of men who, driven by a revelation, challenge the elite of their time over the leadership of their people. That's a Cliff Notes version of the New Testament, for those of you interested in this. Early African converts were themselves members of a small minority within their own political communities. And they thought this story of cultural and religious rejuvenation was tremendously useful in their own political lives. In Kenya, the first generation of Christian converts found their political vocation in a group called the Kikuyu Central Association, founded in 1924 and led by the men whose photographs are shown on the screen. At the center is Johnstone Kamau, later Jomo Kenyatta, to become Kenya's first president. But before he was president of Kenya, Johnstone Kamau was editor of this newspaper, Mwigwithania, launched by the Kikuyu Central Association in 1928. The title gives evidence of their political purpose. The New Testament had been published in Kikuyu in 1926. In Hebrews 12, chapter 12, verse 24, translators had used the word Mwigwithania to refer to Christ, the mediator between the Old Covenant of Judaism and the New Covenant of Christianity. On the pages of the newspaper, the authors of Mwigwithania, the men of the Kikuyu Central Association, used this New Testament concept in order to express their own sense of cultural and political vocation, mediating, as they saw it, between an old dispensation of oral cultural life on the one hand and the new literate world of colonialism in which they lived. Converts argued that they were uniquely positioned to protect their forefathers' oral wisdom against the threat of loss. One of them wrote in 1929, in an excerpt which is shown in translation on the screen, "Remember that formerly there were Kikuyu tales. These caused people to remember many things of former times. If it were possible, those who are grieved for our people should begin to write down everything about former times, the tales like those about ogres, so that afterwards people will be able to read all these things." The newspaper was full of calls for record keeping. for the archiving of endangered cultural property. And in fact, the newspaper itself acted as a kind of venue where this work of cultural preservation could be enacted. Contributors exulted in the permanence of paper and set out to collect proverbs and folk tales from their fathers' mouths, putting them on the page to ensure that they would be handed down to posterity. At a time of great transformation, it was in historical preservation that the men of the Kikuyu Central Association found their calling. They were one of a great number of contemporary organizations that were likewise invested in the curatorship of traditional culture. Rapid urbanization, demographic change, the frailty of human memory, all of these things seemed to early Christian converts to be endangering the fundamental order of their society. Standing at the edge of the colonial world, preservationists used their skills in literacy to reconcile old with new, to reconcile orality with literacy, to reconcile the old religion with the new religion. This is the mechanism by which a great number of Africa's peoples came to be. The Yoruba, the Manyika, the Zulu, the Ganda, the Kikuyu, and hundreds of other people groups were born out of this work of conservative reform as Christian converts looked back upon an oral past and sought to consolidate, standardize, and render textual traditions and ways of life that they feared were in danger of being lost. The changing tides of history made the work of conservation seem both essential and urgent. But there were other ways of reading and other ways of being in time. In 1932, Kagana Wachege had a dream in which the voice of the Lord instructed him to read Hebrews chapter 8, verses 10 through 11, shown on the screen. The biblical text, as you will see, is a refutation of Israel's exclusionary religious hierarchy. In it, God promises that all people shall know me, from the least to the greatest. Kagana Wachege was also instructed to read Psalms chapter 7, where the psalmist instructs or warns that God, as he said, has bent the bow and made it ready. He ordaineth his arrows against the persecutor. In his dream, an angel appeared, showing Chege how to fabricate arrows, and the next morning, Kagana Wachege awoke and set to work making arrows, but not bows, apparently not knowing what the arrows were to be used for. By 1934, Chege's followers, who by this time had become quite proficient in making arrows, had banded together with other nonconformists to form a group called Watu wa Mungu, which was a Thessalonician group meaning in English, the people of God. The people of God refused to wear European shoes or clothing. They let their hair grow long. In one locality, they were said to go about roaring like lions, possibly an imitation of Hosea chapter 11, verse 10, where those who walk with God are said to roar like lions. At another place, they renounced the use of pots, cups, and spoons, since Europeans had brought those things to Kenya. They prophesied that the angel Gabriel was soon to visit the earth, punishing the rich and bringing eternal wealth to the poor. In some places, they refused to pay taxes. British officials thought that the people of God were insane. One policeman commented, as he said, on their peculiar and wild facial expression and wondered whether their derangement, as he said, was a result of their faith or whether they'd been previously unbalanced. Kikuyu Protestants were likewise sure that the people of God were nuts. One Presbyterian teacher, in a letter written to a missionary in Kikuyu, calls them in 1935 Ashenji, meaning barbarians, and wondered, as he wrote, how Satan had enriched the minds of these people. Now, in fact, the people of God belonged to the same intellectual and cultural world that the ambitious reconcilers of the Kikuyu Central Association also inhabited. All the leaders of the people of God were products of the same Protestant missionary schools where the men of the Kikuyu Central Association had studied. But where the leadership of the KCA was parlaying their education into a claim for cultural leadership, the people of God were founding an alternative cultural economy. Here there was no credentialing, no acknowledgement of expertise. The people of God were said to have no teachers. Neither was there a program of instruction. Here there was also a different way of reading Christian texts. Men and women alike had nighttime visions, like Kagana Wachege, directing them toward specific passages in the Bible. The following day, literate men and literate women would read out those passages aloud to a public assembly. For the people of God, there was no narrative momentum that lent meaning and direction to the exposition of the text. They read biblical texts in snippets, looking for specific passages like, "He ordaineth his arrows against the persecutor," that could be the foundation for peculiar behaviors. That's why other Kikuyu Christians found them to be so strange. The mediators of the Kikuyu Central Association were placing themselves at the center of a great historical narrative about the reconciliation of cultures. By contrast, the people of God were plucking passages out of the Bible and creating idiosyncratic lifestyles. They were one among a great number of dissident groups that mined the Bible for material by which to organize peculiar and cloistered ways of living. Non-Conformists saw the Bible as a sticker book. This is an analogy I derive from living with a 6-year-old daughter. A sticker book, that is, an ensemble of separable sentences that could be lifted out of the whole fabric of the book and appended to novel life practices. It was as though they came to the text through the index. Here, the infrastructure of the Bible was particularly salient. The Bible came to colonial Africa with a pre-established architecture. The book was divided into chapters and verses. Virtually every sentence was numbered. Missionaries could and did disagree over orthography, over translation, over vocabulary, over a whole range of theological issues in the translation itself. But the division of the biblical text into chapter and verse was never questioned. The particularized infrastructure of the Bible gave African readers a vehicle by which to apprehend the text through its parts, to read selectively, almost microscopically, and to fasten themselves onto individualized parts of the narrative. In the 1940s, this man, Bildad Kagia, shown on the right in a later picture dating to 1951, but in the late 40s, Bildad Kagia was a soldier serving the British Army in the Second World War. He was posted to Newcastle in England, where he fell in with a group of Assemblies of God Christians. And it was there, immersed in intense Bible study, that Kagia began to compare the English Bible on the one hand with the Kikuyu New Testament, which was at his hands on the other. He wrote to missionaries in 1946 and again in 1949 to complain over errors and mistranslations in the Kikuyu Bible. As he said in one letter, "My intention is to make our translation a real translation from which the English version will not have any difference with the Kikuyu. Some Africans," as he said, "think that the Bible has been greatly altered to suit the English people in ruling Africa." He suggested amendments to several verses, 7 in number, in fact. Heading the list was Galatians chapter 6, verse 6, where Paul instructs the church at Galatia, as he says, that him that is taught the word should communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. Now, Protestant missionaries, in rendering this verse into Kikuyu, had used the Kikuyu verb gaya, meaning to divide, to render the English word communicateth. Kagia, as you might expect, complained that in Kikuyu the phrase seemed to instruct students to give their teachers all of their good things. In this way, he argued in his letter, innocent, trusting, and naive converts had been led by this translation to dispossess themselves of their land and property for the benefit of hypocritical missionaries. Kagia similarly complained about Acts chapter 8, verse 37, where the Ethiopian eunuch is said to have converted to Christianity on the road and to have been baptized. Now this passage, Acts 8:37, had been left out of the Kikuyu Bible, as it is left out of most contemporary English translations of the Bible because it was thought to be uncanonical. Kagia, reading the King James Bible, where 8:37 does exist, complained that this text had been kept from African readers, depriving them of an aspect of their Christian heritage. By 1947, Bildad Kagia, Bible expositor, had gathered around himself a group of several dozen people who diligently set to work uncovering hitherto hidden secrets of the New Testament. They preached in marketplaces without regard to the authority of government chiefs, speaking in tongues, abusing powerful men for their hypocrisy. They refused to pay the fines that government officers imposed upon them. Many of them were therefore imprisoned by government chiefs. When one woman's husband, who had been imprisoned, paid the fine on her behalf, the woman went directly to the marketplace and began to preach again, thus earning another imprisonment immediately. They scorned the formalism of the Anglican and Catholic churches, believing that ordered forms of worship were formalism against the will of God. The movement's most ardent members seem to have been women. In 1948, 50 women were imprisoned in one district for preaching without a permit from local government. Their critics darkly muttered about their morality. An Anglican clergyman in 1948 thought that, as he said, whenever they go to preach, men and women use the same bed and beddings. Even when they're not husband and wife, they say they're dead in body and cannot sin. But members of what came to be called Didiya Kagia, that is, the sect or the religion of Kagia, were not concerned about scandal or propriety. They thought themselves to be a vanguard, set upon the task of, as Kagia put it, demolishing the citadel of ungodly formalism and hypocrisy. Bildad Kagia himself quickly lost interest in the religious movement that he had helped to create. By 1948, only about a year after the formation of Didiya Kagia, Bildad Kagia had disassociated himself from the movement and had entered into the domain of formal politics. He was to go on to a distinguished and controversial career in Kenya's public life. Here he is shown with other members of what was called the Kapenguria Six on the eve of their trial for their leadership of the Mau Mau movement in 1952. He was to spend 8 years in detention along with Jomo Kenyatta as punishment of one of the leaders of Mau Mau. But the textual and interpretive practices that Bildad Kagia had helped to launch in 1947 had their own momentum. In 1959, during the last years of the Mau Mau emergency in central Kenya, worried government officials reported that small groups of men and women were congregating to reinvigorate Didiya Kagia. One local leader, a man named Jonah Kifuthi, refused to attend the district commissioner's public meetings because, as he said, God had appeared to me in a vision and ordered me not to do so. Another local teacher, school teacher that is, refused to teach his pupils hygiene or to conduct classes in physical education, regarding both to be against the will of God. Police intelligence reported that members of the sect refused to use European medicines, opposed government controls over the free movement of people, obstructed surveyors engaged in the consolidation of land, and prayed for the speedy return of Mau Mau detainees. It's hard to overstate how bold these people must have been. Kenya in the late 1950s, particularly central Kenya, was a police state. Tens of thousands of people had been put in detention camps by a paranoid Kenyan colonial government. Thousands of people had been tortured, and hundreds had been killed by British warders in punishment for their membership within the Mau Mau movement. None of this seems to have deterred the courageous members of Didiya Kagia. Their principled and particularized reading of Christian scriptures led them to live in ways that challenged the political authority of colonial government, even in this extraordinarily straitened time. Here, ladies and gentlemen, was a place from which principle could come. Here is a place from which people found principles on which to live. In their investment in particular parts of the Christian Bible, dedicated people found a license that could uphold strange ways of living that were sometimes, as we've seen, illegal. Let me shift now geographically to Western Kenya, a region which is shown on the screen in this map just to the east of Lake Victoria in central East Africa. In Western Kenya, the last decades of the 20th, or the middle decades of the 20th century witnessed the inauguration of dozens of heretical and schismatic sects that were like Dini Yakagia in their oddity and peculiarity. One of them was called Dini Yarohuhuru, the Church of the Free Spirit, founded in 1938 when its leader read on the instruction of an angel verses 20 through 23 of 2 Samuel chapter 6. The text, which is on the screen, as you'll see, describes how King David leapt and danced naked before the Ark of the Covenant, and how Michal, that is the daughter of Saul, scorned him for his untoward display. In the Old Testament text, David defends his display as an act of devotion, and the scornful Michal in verse 23 is said to have remained childless until the end of her days. The members of Dini Yarohuhuru took this rather strange story as a guide for living. In keeping with verse 23, they were opposed to childbirth. They saw childlessness as the just reward for human frailty. They made a habit of confessing their sins while naked, in imitation of King David's guileless display before the Ark of the Covenant. In September 1954, several members of the church were arrested when, at a public meeting in front of an astonished crowd, a man and a woman disrobed and gave their testimonies. They were later arrested and put in jail. Dini Yarohuhuru was one among an ensemble of tiny sects, each of them pursuing their dissident readings of Christian scriptures for their particular interpretive purposes. The Dini Yarohuhuru had about 20 members in 1956. Other groups had somewhat larger constituencies. One that appears in the archival record had about 3,000 members in 1956. It was difficult to sort them out. There's a police report in the Kenyan archives which tries to establish the lineal relationship between different of Western Kenya's schismatic sects. That report runs to fully 50 pages. Government officers didn't know what to do with all of them. There was no organizational leadership with which officials could confer. There was no creed. There wasn't a statement of faith by which to evaluate their religious doctrine. When one of these sects appeared before a local government officer for permission to conduct Christian marriages, the local government officer wrote to Nairobi saying that he found it impossible to pontificate on the question of whether this sect is a Christian church or not. Non-conformists disagreed over very, very small things. It was their granular reading of texts that gave each sect its particularly parochial identity. The members of one sect in Western Kenya called Dini Yarohumaler, members of which are shown on the screen, this is a photograph from the 1980s, they refused to eat with people who were not members of their sect. They spoke to each other in an inspired language, which was largely unintelligible to speakers of the vernacular of the place where they lived. There was a substantial hymnody in the sect's vernacular taught to the young in a small school, which again must have been unintelligible to speakers of ordinary language in this place. Here was a group that was organized around esoteric and deliberately cloistered things. In 1956, they numbered about 2,800 people. There was another group in the late 50s called Dini Yalaluok, which claimed about 400 members. It regarded unconverted people as emissaries of Satan. When an unconverted person visited a member of this sect, the dishes on which that unconverted person had eaten had to be thrown away, and fire had to be passed over the place where the unconverted person had sat. Members of this Dini refused to lend their clothing to unconverted people, neither would they go on journeys in outsiders' company. There was a kind of aggressive insularity to these and other nonconformist groups. They were animated by the particularity of their commitments, by the granularity of their memories and symbols. Here there was no effort to draw outsiders in. to a narrative of redemption. Here instead, there was a kind of static and enclosed way of living in the world. Now, many of these unorthodox sects were to labor in obscurity and eventually to disappear. A few, however, managed to parlay their strange readings of Christian scriptures into a dogma, the foundation for a new denomination. The African Israel Church Nineveh was founded in 1941 by Zakayo Chivuli, formerly a school teacher. Chivuli's son, now the leader of the church, is shown on the screen. Chivuli was inspired by Luke chapter 8, verse 17, which read, "For nothing is secret which shall not be made manifest." They made a practice of confessing their sins in public. Police observers reported that they cried bitterly and sneezed habitually while giving their confessions. The police reported that Zakayo Chivuli had, as one observer said, the facial appearance of a fanatic, but the manner of a hard-headed businessman. Church officials kept careful books detailing collections and listing catechumens. Chivuli was especially careful about politics. When he presided at a gathering of the church in Nairobi, he told attendees in 1955 to pray for the British government. His political loyalism was controversial, certainly, but it was also strategically important. In the mid-1950s, when many of Kenya's African-run churches were closed down by a paranoid colonial government, Chivuli's church went through a period of expansion. The church's flag, which features green, white, and orange, was said by members of the church to stand for the three different races of Kenya cohabiting in happy unity. By 1958, the church boasted about 5,000 members, with branches in Mombasa on the Kenyan coast, Mwanza in northern Tanzania, and Musoma in western Tanzania. In 1963, when Kenya was preparing for independence, Zakayo Chivuli was confident enough to write to the Council of Ministers to ask for a special seat in Kenya's parliament. Today, the African Israel Church Nineveh has some 500,000 members and 3,500 clergy, and is a constituent member of the World Council of Churches. The history of this church, of Chivuli's church, suggests that the distance between nonconformity on the one hand and orthodoxy on the other was by no means unbridgeable. But in order to get leverage and recognition within the colonial world, nonconformists had to find a narrative on which to position themselves. They had, that is, to claim a lineage and create a story linking their contemporary faith to antique precedents. That's what it took in colonial times to scale up nonconformity. They had to find institutions and frameworks that could render idiosyncratic readings of the Bible legible to government and to the establishment. They had to place themselves within a history that could authenticate the oddities and peculiarities of their commitments. Nonconformists' experiments with narrative self-positioning were sometimes extraordinarily ambitious. And in some places in the colonial archive of East Africa, it's possible actually to see Christian nonconformists casting about for a narrative to claim. My favorite nonconformist in East Africa's history is undoubtedly a man named Reuben Spartus, a Ugandan activist, one of the great makers of East Africa's political and intellectual life. Reuben Spartus was born in 1899 and educated in King's College Budo, which was then Uganda's leading school. He enlisted in the King's African Rifles in the years following the First World War, was posted as a teacher to a military school north of Kampala. During his military service, he began to read Marcus Garvey's newspaper, Negro World, and gathered regularly with other groups of servicemen to talk about Garvey's ideas. He and his fellows formed an organization called the Pan-African Association and opened up a correspondence with the Kenyan dissident Harry Thuku in the mid-1920s. These letters have recently come to light in the newly cataloged deposits of the Uganda National Archives. And they show him, that is Reuben Spartus, searching for a position by which to launch a critique of colonial Uganda's politics. Writing to Thuku in 1925, Reuben Spartus cast a wide net. As he said, "I'm struggling, striving, trying day and night to have something done for my beloved race, the African, and I shall not end until the whole black race, the whole of Africa, has been thoroughly redeemed. Therefore be of good cheer, because we, the brave, true, determined sons of Africa, are ready to fight to the last man for independence." This in 1925. In 1927, Reuben Spartus was discharged from the army, honorably discharged from the army, and opened a school of his own in a suburb outside Kampala. And it was at this time that he began to experiment with Eastern Orthodoxy. In 1929, Reuben Spartus writes to government officials identifying himself as supervisor of the African Orthodox Church of Uganda. His glorious title notwithstanding, Reuben Spartus's whole congregation in 1929 seems to have consisted of one person. Nonetheless, later that year, he opens up a correspondence with this man. This man's name is Reverend David William Alexander, Bishop of Marcus Garvey's African Orthodox Church in South Africa. Alexander on the one hand and Spartus on the other open up a correspondence about arrangements for an ordination service in Uganda. Bishop Alexander, promised, as he wrote, that it will be a great day for Africa when an African in the heart of Africa will be ordained into the priesthood by an African bishop. Bishop Alexander visited Uganda for several months in 1931 and 1932, ordained Reuben Spartus and one of his colleagues as the first priests of the African Orthodox Church in East Africa on the 22nd of June, 1922. The crowd at the ordination service numbered 1,600 people. The newspaper man who covered the event reported that the Mass was sung in the key of F. It was sung, as he said, most carefully, showing that those who had sung it had taken much time and patience to learn it. What was it that Reuben Spartus found in this most recondite of orthodoxies? For Reuben Spartus, being orthodox was a way of recentering the religious and cultural hierarchies that defined the public life of colonial Uganda. The kingdom of Buganda, in the very center of the colony of Uganda, the kingdom of Buganda was the most avowedly Anglican society in all of colonial Africa. The 1900 agreement, which had been signed between the British Crown on the one hand and the ruler of the kingdom of Buganda on the other, was the legal cement that had confirmed the place of the Protestant church within the political hierarchy of the kingdom. It consolidated power in the hands of a hierarchy of Protestant chiefs, eliminating spirit mediums, ritual experts, and other intermediaries who had formerly exercised authority in Buganda's politics. By the 1930s, Protestants were by far the dominant religious and cultural force in the kingdom's public affairs. The king himself, this is Kabaka Daudi Chwa, and his ministers were all avowed Anglicans. For dissidents like Reuben Spartus, it was the antiquity of Eastern Orthodoxy that seems to have appealed. Orthodoxy made establishment Protestantism appear specious, a form of religious charlatanry. It placed African dissidents in the center of things. In a 1933 letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Reuben Spartus described how, as a student in an Anglican school, he had once felt, as he said, unrest, very dull, very miserable, very, very tired for the disunion that predominates over our Christian church. But then, he said, he read church history and found that the Anglican and Catholic churches were only branches, but not the real and actual foundation of Christianity, and not the true or exact church founded, built, and established by Christ himself and his apostles. For the activist Spartus, orthodoxy allowed for the repositioning of dissident Christianity within a history that vastly predated Anglicanism, making Buganda's political establishment appear parochial and schismatic. In 1931, Reuben Spartus composed 1935 rather, Reuben Spartus composed a letter to the Anglican bishop encouraging him to introduce crucifixes and church art into Anglican buildings. When the bishop called upon him to repent for encouraging schism, Spartus replied by positioning the African Orthodox Church within a long and proud history, as you'll see in the correspondence on the screen. What sin did I commit? I am exceedingly and deeply sorry to state that I will surely never repent until Martin Luther, Calvin, Erasmus, King Henry VIII, the Huguenots, Barrow, Parker, Wycliffe, Cranmer, King Edward VIII. Anyway, you can read the rest of. There's a long list here of dissidents of one kind or the other. Now, Reuben Spartus's dissidence was particularly effectively waged in his postal correspondence. Stationery, among other things, is a place from which to write. Spartus was well aware of the work that stationery could do, and as you can perhaps see from the return addresses on this correspondence, he took particular care over the addresses from which he wrote. His first correspondence with the African bishop was headed with the Garveyite phrase, Africa for Africans. The return address was given as follows: the African Orthodox Church, an independent African Episcopal Church with apostolic succession through the Patriarchal See of St. Peter at Antioch. This is the return address on the letter. Now, as you'll guess, this was not meant to ensure the smooth working of the postal system. Spartus was writing from a religious point of address, a theological position, not from a particular postal location. In later correspondence, he began to describe the church and school he'd erected in Bombo outside Kampala with the name Villa Jerusalem in his return address. In later years, he experimented with other kinds of return addresses on behalf of the African Orthodox Church. In 1931, for instance, he wrote to the Anglican bishop under the Latin heading Pax Tebis, meaning something like peace with us, although it's not actually an accurate usage of Latin, I'm told by my colleagues in classics. In subsequent correspondence, he headed his letters with the phrase Pax Nobiscum. These were pastoral greetings. They established a kind of hierarchical position between Reuben Spartus, an African dissident on the one hand, and the Anglican British bishop of the Church of Uganda on the other. Even though he owned and used a typewriter, all of Spartus's correspondence on behalf of the African Orthodox Church was composed in flowing, beautiful calligraphy, as you can see from the screen. His letters resembled the beautiful manuscripts that are the founding documents of medieval Christian faith. This was a form of dissenting religion that was anchored within the deep time of Christianity. Becoming Orthodox was a way of inverting the civilizational hierarchy of colonial Uganda, of transforming a colonized people into forebears of their British rulers. It was an act of civilizational jujitsu. As a form of religious and cultural criticism, Spartus's church proved to be both enduring and also popular. By the 1960s, Spartus was responsible for the supervision of several Orthodox churches in Uganda and in Kenya. In 1961, on the eve of Uganda's independence, he traveled to Greece to drum up financial support for his church. Thereafter, priests of the African Orthodox Church were trained in Athens by the Greek Orthodox. In 1968, the African Orthodox Church was admitted as a full member of the newly formed Uganda Joint Churches Council. And today, the African Orthodox Church in Uganda claims 300,000 members with 67 ordained clergy. There were other narrative architectures with which Reuben Spartus could and did experiment. At the very same time that Reuben Spartus was writing on behalf of the African Orthodox Church in calligraphy from the return addresses that I've just shown, he was also experimenting with other forms of address. In 1945, we know from police intelligence reports that there were at least 15 different political organizations that used Reuben Spartus's post office box as their return address, number 508, Kampala. Among others, Spartus seems to have been responsible for corresponding on behalf of the Baganda Landlords Council, the Baganda Credit Bank, the Uganda African Chamber of Commerce, and the Uganda African Motor Drivers Union. These organizations spoke on an astonishingly wide range of constituencies and interests. Reuben Spartus seems to have played an active role in superintending their correspondence, and he probably took pleasure in trying out the different voices that they afforded him. One voice in which we know he took great pleasure was as one of the Bazukulu Bachintu, the Sons of Kintu. The organization, the Sons of Kintu, was inaugurated in 1938, around the time that Spartus was also organizing the African Orthodox Church. A crowd of 60 people gathered in Old Kampala. Spartus was the main speaker, duly elected president. His postal box, number 508, thereafter became the mailing address for the Sons of Kintu. Now, Kintu is the mythical founder of Buganda's political community. He's the Adam of Buganda's religious life. In distant times, Kintu is said to have inaugurated the kingdom of Buganda and fathered the royal line. By calling themselves the Sons of Kintu, Reuben Spartus and his colleagues were leveling out the differences between themselves and the Protestant aristocrats who governed the kingdom. As you'll see from this missive, dating to 1939, Spartus conventionally headed his correspondence for the Sons of Kintu with a slogan, which recurs in all of his correspondence on behalf of this outfit. Katondo umu, ekigwenanera chimu, ekigumunulu chimu, or one God, one aim, one destiny. It was a reminder of a shared identity. It kind of had a propulsive force in some sense that invited all readers to see themselves as one pushing toward a common aim. When the Kabaka, that is the ruler of the kingdom of Buganda, refused in 1939 to recognize the Sons of Kintu as a legitimate political organization, Spartus replied by insisting that his association spoke for all Ganda people. As he wrote, "This organization includes all the Ganda from every corner of Buganda country, including the ministers, the chiefs, and the members of the legislature, because the chiefs and all who form the Buganda government take their origin from Kintu, as well as ourselves." He thereafter made out his return address on behalf of the Sons of Kintu, as you'll see, as Reuben Spartus, Office of the Kintu Descendants, all Bugandas. It was from this position, as a spokesman for all Ganda people, that Spartus addressed himself to Buganda's aristocracy. In a series of letters in 1938 and 1939, Reuben Spartus and other Sons of Kintu campaigned for a more democratic, more responsive government. They asked that chiefs who had previously been appointed by the king should be subject to a popular election. They asked that the newspaper business, which has been closely controlled by the Buganda government, should be free to report on political controversies. They wanted loans from government to set up small businesses. They asked that latrines should be built as a means of improving public hygiene. They wanted a committee to write a grammar for the Ganda language. The Sons of Kintu were advocating for an infrastructure of democracy. God, as Spartus wrote, was no respecter of persons. He inspires men with truth and justice to work and live for the welfare and protection of their fellow men. His letters, written on behalf of the Sons of Kintu, were all, as you'll see from the screen, composed on a typewriter. They don't look like the beautiful manuscripts that he composed for the African Orthodox Church. This was a demotic correspondence. It was meant to be reproduced. It was carbon copied, as you'll see from the screen perhaps. This is a blue copy suggesting that it's one of several sets of copies that have been typed out by Spartus on his typewriter. These letters were addressed and reproduced and circulated among a community that was founded on fraternity, on shared descent from a common ancestor. Spartus and his colleagues were grounding Ganda polity within the space of lineal time, the space of fraternity and equality. And in so doing, they were also constituting themselves as brothers bound by blood and history to resist tyranny. Here was a colonial subject who would not stay in place. Reuben Spartus was not engaged in the recovery of ancient customs, in the revivification of endangered cultural property, in the honoring of ancient precedent, or in the reconciliation of new with old. His activism was not structured by the narrative of cultural redemption that informed conservative reformers through the rest of colonial Africa. Spartus was nimble. He moved from position to position, looking for a footing by which to more effectively address the problems and controversies of his time. That's why he could be, at the same time, a priest of the African Orthodox Church and one of the sons of Chintu. Everywhere he worked to open up a space for commoners, for the undoing of autocracies, for the ending of dictatorship. In the late 40s, in the last passage of Reuben Spartus's political life, he was at the head of a new organization called the Bataka Union, an outfit which he founded and led. This meeting of the Bataka Union took place, one of many meetings of its kind, on the grounds of Reuben Spartus's home. Thousands of commoners riding their bicycles came from Kampala to gather in Spartus's peri-urban household to engage in political dialogue. At a time when wives, clients, and children customarily knelt in the presence of their social betters, members of the Bataka Union conventionally greeted each other with shouts of boo, an abbreviation of the acronym Bataka Union, the name of their organization. As Spartus told a crowd in 1948, "We must squeeze together and hold together like wax. We are one nation, there is no distinction." The Bataka, like the sons of Kintu before them, called for the democratization of Buganda's parliament, for a popular election to choose government chiefs, for increased educational opportunities for commoners. They even called for reserved seats for women, this in 1948. On one day in April 1949, the Bataka assembled in thousands on the grounds of the palace of the king of their kingdom, the Kabaka, demanding a hearing from the aristocrats and from the king himself who governed them. There was a riot that ensued on that April morning, and over the days that followed, 115 buildings were burnt. 75 of them belonged to officials of the Kingdom of Buganda. Rioters also burned the houses of a profiteering butcher and the editor of a pro-government newspaper. Not a single building owned by the Anglican Church was burned. In the aftermath of the riots, Reuben Spartus was convicted of rebellion against the Kabaka and sentenced to 16 years in prison. In colonial Africa, men and women of the establishment saw themselves as curators of ancestral culture. Through organizations like the Kikuyu Central Association, they invented traditions, preserved patrimonies, documented their forefathers' wisdom. They saw themselves as a majority, a people. It is their declensionist view of time, as a long struggle against amnesia, loss, and indiscipline. It's this view that predominates in the archives with which historians are obliged to work. Other people, a minority, condemned by their establishment contemporaries, created ways of living that were peculiar and enclosed. Non-conformists did not protect a patrimony. They didn't honor their father's wisdom. Their dissident politics, I've argued in the earlier part of this lecture, was structured by their particularized way of reading. Non-conformists read granularly and selectively, snipping text out of the Bible and using them to uphold a peculiar life. They lived at a tangent to the great dialectics of their age. Over time, some dissidents, like Reuben Spartus, managed to position themselves in a narrative that could authenticate their religious activity and expand their constituencies. That entailed experimentation with voice, with what Mikhail Bakhtin calls addressivity. But most of these dissident churches were disinterested in outreach. They didn't try to make converts. It is for us, professional scholars and students of history, to recover their stories, for most of them do not have heirs to carry on their idiosyncratic ways of life. What seems to me to be needed in our contemporary times are not histories of continuity, but histories of dead ends and oddities. In the recovery of idiosyncratic lifestyles, scholars can fortify contemporary public culture with a more robustly diverse account of the past and furnish today's nonconformists with a history to claim for themselves. Thanks very much. the question of whether it took a particular qualification or not to experience a divine revelation differs between different kinds of organizations. So the Watu wa Mungu, with whom I started my lecture today, the substantial part of the lecture, seem to have been indiscriminate in their willingness to recognize the revelations of virtually any member of the sect who had a nighttime dream and who the next morning would report on what they'd been instructed to read, which would then be read out. It was an organization that seems to have been distinctly opposed to the idea that qualification or credentialing of any kind could structure religious revelation. Other nonconformist groups recognize specific individuals as channels for revelatory discourse. So one particularly interesting group is called Dini ya Miriam, Western Kenya, the 1950s. It's a woman named Miriam who has a vision of Christ which instructs her and her people to live in ways that are odd. She's interned by the Kenyan authorities under emergency laws. This is during the Mau Mau emergency, and spends 6 years living in Kisii, far away from her home, under detention. During that whole period of 6 years, members of her sect go to visit her repeatedly in Kisii, seeking new revelations from her, which she continues to offer despite being under detention. They carry these revelations back to Luoland, to Nyanza, the place where she lives, and carry forward the movement even as she herself is removed from the scene for some time. Today, Dini ya Miriam continues to flourish. It's a Catholic charismatic cult that looks to this otherwise illiterate woman as the founding place for the religious tradition. So again, the channeling of religious revelation varied from group to group. It was easier, frankly, for government authorities to deal with outfits like Dini ya Miriam, in which the individual responsible for revelation could be removed from the scene. Indiscriminate revelation always troubled government authorities, for whom this was a distinct problem, in fact. What kinds of text nonconformists read is an interesting question. Until the 50s, reading or getting revelations from the Old Testament would have been quite hard for many people in Kenya because the Old Testament hadn't been published in vernacular languages, as I mentioned at the start of my talk. Nonetheless, it seems that both in central and in western Kenya, revelations often directed readers toward Old Testament texts, which they read in Swahili. The Swahili Old Testament was available from the late 19th century forward and was widely distributed across East Africa. Whether it's likely, I don't know this, but it's likely that preaching and exposition upon Old Testament text must have involved translative work and exposition, very likely in vernacular as opposed to Swahili language. Swahili is a lingua franca in East Africa, which in the 50s was not widely understood by most of Kenya's people. It was an urban language and a trade language. So it's likely that the men and women who undertook the interpretation of revelations worked from the Swahili text and then exposited in Doluo or Kikuyu or Lubukusu or some other languages of East Africa. So that's a brief answer to. After the 50s, when Bibles are available in their totality in vernacular languages, it becomes hard to say exactly how. I mean, it is always hard to say exactly what text people were directed toward. Revelations seem to have been pretty indiscriminate. I'd say that the Old Testament is fuller in its in the models that it offers for odd ways of living than the New, and most of these revelatory discourses seem to me to have been directed toward Old Testament texts. I think I can address Ian, Dr. Fall, and Chris, at least in some regards, together. I call them nonconformists because I'm contrasting their way of reading with what seems to me to be the predominant form of Christian practice in colonial Africa, and that is a form of Christianity in which Christian identity and ethnic or racial identity are very tightly intertwined. I'm trying to contrast conformity on the one hand with nonconformity on the other. Not so much to suggest a center and periphery, although one could, particularly in places like Buganda, make an argument about center and periphery, as I did. But rather to suggest that these are contending modes of social organization in which, on the one hand, in the mid-20th century, as I've suggested, for reasons to do with early converts' perceptions of the time in which they lived. There was an effort to rehabilitate inherited custom, to reground tradition within a textual environment by collecting folk tales, by writing ethnohistorical work, by engaging in the labor of cultural recovery, by undertaking legal programs that could reinforce patriarchy. This was a deeply gendered effort to constitute tradition, which worked hand in glove with what I called in my lecture establishment Christianity, by which I mean the Christianity of mostly mission churches, although often African-run churches were very much invested in this form of conservative reform as well. So I'm trying to signal here, on the one hand, the predominant discourse of the mid-20th century in East Africa, which is about the need to rehabilitate endangered customs in the face of dramatic political and economic change. In that sense, to work within Dr. Fall's terminology, the predominant frame of political activism in the 50s is to do with order, reconstituting a structure that was endangered so as to ground African politics in preparation for independence and self-government. We need authentic institutions, we need workable legal codes, we need cultural symbols that we can work with in order to make ourselves self-governing in anticipation of self-rule. Nonconformity is a way of signaling the fact that a great number of people, such as those that I've discussed in the majority of this lecture, were not engaged in this same kind of labor. They weren't engaged in rehabilitative work. Instead, they were engaged in this, as Tomo, it's Tomo, right? Tomoki put it. They were engaged in these granular readings of texts that looked not to the Bible for inspiration about how to recover cultures, but rather that looked to the Bible for little snippets that could be used to orient ways of life. I would say that in answer to your question, Tomoki, the people I called nonconformists were not creators of doctrine in any way. They weren't particularly bothered about whether or not they were engaged with fundamental Christian doctrines or not. Their reading of the New Testament set them against orthodoxy and doctrine per se. They didn't create texts that listed their beliefs. They didn't create position statements. They didn't create theological discourses until coming now to the question I was asked by Jessica about independence. I think that was your question, right?
Well, sort of
Ian's and right. Independence, right, from Ian, and also the question about what does having a religion do. I mean, look, in the 60s, quite suddenly, in ecumenical terms, there's a much wider gate by which Africans could be recognized as authentically Christian. The World Council of Churches opens up a framework by which churches that had earlier been regarded as idiosyncratic and weird could then quite suddenly be incorporated into large international ecumenical outfits, claim membership. So after independence, across East Africa, there are national churches, councils that are set up, one for Kenya, one for Uganda, one for Tanganyika. These quite quickly cohere with each other to form an African Council of Churches that in turn feeds the WCC with African memberships, such that, as I mentioned in my talk, several, although by no means the majority of the churches that I was talking about, end up today as members of the WCC and spokesmen for African Christianity, a position which their forebears would never have wanted to take upon themselves. I think that there is something here about how independence and the framework of cultural and political and religious discourse after the 60s obliges even idiosyncratic churches like the African Israel Church Nineveh, about which I talked, to speak in the language of theological multiplicity, to argue that theirs is an authentically African Christianity, and to make arguments that their founders would never have created. After the 60s, for reasons that I signaled in the start of the lecture, African Christians have to speak as though they're spokesmen for an inherited, specific, racially coded African Christianity that's of a different kind than Western Christianity, that's homogenous, that's grounded in native religion, that can, in some sense, diversify world Christianity. And I think that's kind of a problem. Actually, it's a product of the 60s coherence of cultural politics and national sovereignty that deprives us of the chance to understand the diversity of lineages and variety of theological impulses that guided African religious thought in the first half of the 20th century, and makes it impossible also to think about dissidence as being as much part of African history as conformity. The problem, if I could be so bold as to say, in African cultural politics, and this is an outsider speaking about a place that's not my own, but the places that I'm talking about are home to the most virulently anti-gay politics in Africa, Uganda not least. And I think it is really important that scholars in the West and in the global South would be willing to go back to colonial history and to reconstruct traditions of cultural interpretation that don't presume a tight fit between culture on the one hand and people's identity on the other, that recognize that there were a variety of ways of being Christian and being African, and that the recovery of those ways of life can help, in some sense, embolden today's dissidents and furnish gay activists and other dissident Christians with material by which to work. The world in which we live is contingent. It's not a necessary product of history. And recovering that, what happened before the 60s coherence of tradition, culture, church, and such, and race is really important. So a few other questions. I've launched into kind of a sermon. I'm sorry for that. But okay, so other questions I was asked. Chris asked a few interesting questions. This photo was taken by a police special branch observer who was keeping an eye on the Botaka Union because it was thought, quite rightly, that this movement was going to present a threat to colonial government in Uganda. Were nonconformists engaged in any meaningful way with Islam? As far as I can tell, the answer is no. In East Africa, Islam is very much a coastal religion and a religion of cities. It's a religion of city people, that is. It's conducted largely in Kiswahili, not in vernacular. This is somewhat different. In Buganda, there is a long and deep Islamic history that actually predates Christianity, Muslim missionaries in Buganda prior to Christian. But in Buganda, like in other parts of Eastern Africa, Christian political discourse largely is conducted as an argument among different varieties of Christianity. In Buganda, Islam and Muslims are subordinated within the cultural hierarchy of the place after the events of the late 19th century, which I briefly referenced in my lecture. And so there's not a need for Protestant and Catholic activists to explicitly engage in theological argumentation until rather later, in the later 20th century. Let me see. And then Rob asked about Diniyam Sambwa. So Diniyam Sambwa was one of the dozens or hundreds of different sects in Western Kenya, as Rob mentioned, founded by this inspired figure named Elijah Masinde, who was one of the type that I talked about in my answer to the first question, for whom revelation, he was the channel for revelation in some sense. It cohered around him. You're quite right, Rob, of course, that British paranoia about Diniyam Sambwa prefigures paranoia about Mau Mau. Not least, as you rightly point out, it's an interethnic organization. It's also, by the way, a group that crosses colonial borders. There's a great number of Ugandan devotees of Diniyam Sambwa in the 40s and 50s too, which likewise was a great problem. I mean, it's important to say that colonial government worked with categories that presumed the integrity and homogeneity of ethnic groups. Groups like the ones that I'm talking about, which at least some of them propounded an interethnic comedy, were problematic not only for religious or sort of interpretational reasons, as I've suggested, but also because they challenged the architecture of indirect rule. And in that sense, yes, it is, there's not very much evidence to work with when thinking about the demographic history of nonconformist movements, but the shreds of evidence about membership suggest that in fact nonconformists very often drew indiscriminately people who found in their revelations meaningful direction for their lives without regard to what cultural and linguistic group they came from. Right, right. I think that's all of them. Thank you.